Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Call of Duty Advanced Warfare for PC, Xbox 360, Xbox One, PlayStation 3, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter developed by Sledgehammer Games and published by Activision in November of 2014, and it went on to get kind of a mixed reception. On the one hand, some people really liked it, and other people really hated it. But then again, it is rather popular to hate Call of Duty right now, even if you have absolutely no basis whatsoever for doing so. I mean, let's face it, when most people say they hate Call of Duty, they can't actually give you a proper reason as to why they hate it other than they're simply tired of the series. In which case I ask them, why are they bothering to continue playing the series? But then again, what nonsense am I talking? This is modern gaming, there is no room for rationality here, right? Ugh. Anyway, this is where the series started to kind of jump the shark a bit in terms of the tech, because before they were all relatively modern technology. It was a bit stretched in ghosts, but then you get to this and you have exosuits, you have directed energy weapons, and there's all kinds of crazy sci-fi stuff going on, which is a trend that would continue with Black Ops 3 and now the seemingly reviled Infinite Warfare, even though Infinite Warfare has not even come close to actually being released. Go figure. Apparently these days we can't even wait for a game to get released before we start acting like it's the worst thing since Superman 64. But I'm sure at this point you're like, DW, get to the point already. You're rambling about Infinite Warfare. This video isn't even about Infinite Warfare. You're right, but here's the point of that little ramble. Advanced Warfare actually received the same treatment. Before it was even released, people were already acting like it was the worst thing ever. And it's not. In fact, it's something entirely different. So let's go ahead and delve right into it and find out exactly what that means. Well, as far as presentation goes, at least on the PC and console versions, this thing is leaps and bounds ahead of Call of Duty Ghosts. Not to say that Ghosts didn't have its moments here and there, but Advanced Warfare just takes it up an entirely different level. You have a surprisingly believable aesthetic where the game is set in basically 2055 up through 2061, and you could definitely believe the world looking like that at some point. Everything is rather futuristic, but there's also a lot of the old world still there, so you have this really nice mixture of the old stuff and the brand new technological Marvel stuff, and it actually works extremely well for the game. And as far as the actual visual quality goes, they actually did a really good job with it. Character models and animations are generally very well done, and the animations themselves end up looking pretty lifelike in most respects. The facial animations in particular actually are very well done compared to previous Call of Duty games. And the amount of detail packed into the environments is pretty impressive. I mean, the environment artists really went to town on this thing, and it looks great. But where cracks start to show in the visuals are in aspects like the texture quality, which is only fairly good. It's not amazing, it's just fairly good for what it is, which is a current-gen console game primarily. So some of the textures end up looking better than others, but then there's the really nasty thing that comes up with the presentation, at least on PC. There's just something wrong with the way it loads assets into your memory so that it actually slows to a crawl sometimes when you're actually playing the game. I have a clip here to show you to explain what I'm talking about, but you'll be moving along and then all of a sudden your frame rate will completely tank no matter what your frame rate was before. I mean, I have literally gone from over 100 frames a second, sometimes even over 300 frames a second if there's not a lot being rendered on screen, down to slideshow levels. And the only thing I've really seen that actually kind of explains that is that people who are running it on SSDs tend to have a lot better luck in that regard. I'm not running an SSD, I'm just running a normal hard drive, and if that's the case, then that would explain why my performance would tank all of a sudden while I was trying to load stuff in. Either way, it only seems to pop up in the single player, and it is completely unacceptable because it makes the game basically unplayable at times. Most of the time the game runs fine, and on occasion you'll get some frame rate issues, but generally speaking it's not going to be to the point where it completely tanks your performance to the point where it's unplayable. But when that does happen, it's pretty infuriating. And the game has outright crashed on me on occasion. Now, admittedly, that's only during the single player, but still, it's pretty much unacceptable. What's slightly more tolerable is the frame rate hitching during the actual cutscenes, the pre-rendered cutscenes, I should say, that are displayed between levels. Because it's loading stuff in while it's displaying those cutscenes, and even though they're at 30 frames a second, they end up actually hitching on occasion as well. But at least those are just loading screens masked by cutscenes rather than gameplay segments that have tanky frame rates. So the presentation being relatively high quality ends up coming at something of a price, and I'm really not sure why they never managed to fix that up for the PC version. But what does end up getting a bit problematic is the sound design, because while you have actually really solid voice acting, where Kevin Spacey in particular just steals the show.
So let's be clear. I am here to solve the world's problems. And I believe the world's problems begin with you.
And of course, Troy Baker and the others do an admirable job as well. You have music that is only alright at best, with most of the tracks being this sort of electronic music that works okay for the game but isn't really all that memorable. And you have sound effects which are generally pretty crappy, honestly. The explosions don't have anywhere near enough bass to them, the gunfire sounds absolutely pathetic, and the melee sounds are just kind of goofy because they mixed in the exosuit sounds with them. So while you end up with some really solid voice acting, the rest of the sound design is lackluster at best, and at worst, it's pretty awful. But I've seen a hell of a lot worse, let's put it that way. It's just weird to think that this series has been going on this long and still hasn't nailed gun sounds. I'm just baffled by it. But luckily none of this drags the game down too horribly. I mean, the sound effects are pretty wimpy in general, but you can kind of live with those as long as you just put it in the back of your mind. And if you put that in the back of your mind, you can focus on what really matter here, which are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as Jack Mitchell, who joins the Marines with his best friend Will Irons, and they end up getting deployed into Seoul, South Korea, in order to repel an invasion from North Korea. And the short version of that is that Mitchell ends up losing his arm and Irons ends up getting killed, and at the funeral you end up getting introduced to Jonathan Irons, the CEO of the largest military corporation in the world, Atlas, who offers Mitchell a second chance as well as an advanced prosthetic arm to replace the one he just lost. Obviously, Mitchell ends up taking him up on that offer and ends up joining Atlas to become, eventually, one of Irons' most trusted operatives. And under his leadership, you go after the KVA, a global terrorist organization that is hell-bent on basically knocking society back to the Stone Age. And in fact, they pretty much succeed at that endeavor. They end up wiping out a lot of power plants across the globe and thus sending society into basically chaos. And who steps into that chaos to restore order? Atlas. And if you don't see Jonathan Irons becoming the antagonist right from the get-go, then you're pretty much oblivious. It is foreshadowed extremely heavily because Call of Duty is not exactly subtle at this point. And let's face it, pretty much everybody knows Kevin Spacey being in House of Cards as a basically antagonist as well, so there's that. He's just really good at playing a role like that. Anyway, point being that Irons knew the plans of the KVA and he actually didn't do anything about it. He acted like he didn't know anything in order for Atlas to be able to seize power from all the world governments, and he succeeds at that plan. So it's up to you to stop him. And one thing that you notice throughout the game is that even though it is hell-bent on providing a massive Hollywood action thriller vibe, it actually succeeds at sort of bringing back that old-school Call of Duty vibe. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that it tries to explore some wider themes than simply shooty bang bang. Themes like what place does national identity have in the digital age, and how much power should these private militaries have, as well as the struggles of soldiers when they're sent into a combat zone to fight a war they don't really have any stakes in for profit or for the nebulous reasons of government officials who are looking to profit. The problem mostly comes in how they try to explore those. They're more background ideas that are just kind of in the back of your mind while you're playing the game, and it's really focused more on the now, what you're doing in that specific moment, and making sure that it's both fun, action-packed, and fits in with the main plot. And while that plot does suffer a bit from the fact that this is a modern Call of Duty game and thus it has to be all Hollywood action all the time, it is nice to see them trying to bring back that feel of the old school Call of Duties, rather than simply going Hollywood action and nothing else. You especially don't get any of that complete nonsense, more elite than elite crap that you saw in Call of Duty Ghosts, where you were just so unbelievably badass they would hesitate to call you human. In this, it's oddly quaint how it deals with how your player character is a badass. You're a soldier doing your job, and the game doesn't make it out to be anything else. Sure, you often do incredibly badass things, but they make it pretty clear that a lot of that is your equipment and not really you. It's actually oddly refreshing. And beyond all of that, the actual campaign itself is one of the better Call of Duty campaigns. It has plenty of variety, from just running around on foot segments with tons of variation in your exo abilities. For example, you can get a shield that blocks incoming fire, or you can get a grapple later on in the game that not only can send you flying all over the map, but you can actually use it to reel enemies in and then take them out with a single hit. Or you'll get a time dilation ability with your Exo that basically gives you slow motion powers. And then of course later on in the game you also get things like cloaking, which is also pretty cool. And a lot of the time you can even do a sort of boost jump where it's kind of a jet pack that you use when you jump into the air. And you can also boost to the sides, kind of like the dodges in Unreal Tournament, which makes this particular Call of Duty game actually have quite a bit of speed to it, as well as quite a bit of verticality, which is something we don't really see in Call of Duty games. Again, it is very refreshing to see that, though I do wish more of that managed to make it into the multiplayer, but I'll get to that in a moment. But the cool thing about the Exo abilities is that they're not the only thing that really does spice up the gameplay. You've got turret segments, sure, but they're done in a way that's actually kind of cool. You get some vehicle segments where you get to pilot a jet, or you get to blaze around in the canals in a boat that feels like it's ripped straight out of The World Is Not Enough, or getting to drive a hover tank later on, or even getting into these huge mech suits that you can walk around in and use some particularly heavy ordnance with. The game never has you doing one thing so much that you get sick of it before it decides to spice the game up. It's actually interspersed very, very well, and the pacing of the campaign ends up being excellent as a result. In fact, I'd argue that the campaign is this game's biggest asset. It's a really damn good Call of Duty campaign. It's not as good as 1, 2, or 4, certainly, not by a long shot, but it's still a really damn good modern Call of Duty campaign, arguably the best one since Black Ops, and admittedly Black Ops was more of a matter of they just kind of rolled with how ridiculous the game was. As I said, this one's more reminiscent of the older school Call of Duty games, and so it doesn't stack up quite as well to those, but stacking up to the others, it's one of the better ones. But then you have the rest of the game, where you have Exo Zombies, which honestly I barely even bother with. I mostly just went into that to get footage for this review. I've never liked the Zombies modes in the Call of Duty games. Zombies in general just bore me. So your mileage may vary on that. It's basically just the Zombies mode with Exo abilities. There's not much more to say than that. You fight off basically endless waves of zombies, you get gear as you go along, you use your Exo abilities to enhance the combat experience, and there's a variety of zombie types that you're going to run into, but generally speaking it's kind of boring because zombies. Though again, your mileage may vary with that because a lot of people really like the Zombies modes for some baffling reason, and of course it's co-op as well, so there is that. But then there's the versus multiplayer aspect, and there's something I would like to show you that basically sums up how the multiplayer is in Advanced Warfare. As you can see, it's dead. I mean, there's still a few people playing it, but not really enough that I could actually manage to get into a game anymore. Luckily, I managed to play this back when it had a free weekend, so I do know how the multiplayer was, and you can still play bot matches, so there is that. But the multiplayer is pretty much dead, so there's not much reason to bother with it, at least not on PC right now. But of course that begs the question of why. I mean, hell, I was able to get into Call of Duty Ghosts matches just fine, and most people seem to hate that one. Die-hard Call of Duty fans included. So what makes Advanced Warfare so special? Well, first off, apparently they screwed up the online system to where it just won't even display games anymore. But on top of that, the gameplay itself is just a mess. All the features you would expect from a modern Call of Duty game are there. Copious amounts of score streaks, a create a class system with the pick 10 system, or in this case I believe it's pick 13, where you can customize your class to your liking, where you may have only a primary weapon or only a secondary weapon or no weapons at all, and just have tons of perks and score streaks and whatever. The difference being that this time score streaks actually count towards your pick 13 total, so you do need to be aware of that. That said, the actual streaks themselves are rather difficult to get simply because it's pretty easy to die in this thing. That isn't as much of a problem on console, but on PC we have a lot more precision and speed with our aiming, so we don't really end up having the same problem that console players do and that they often complain about, which is they can't hit the target. We can hit the enemies just fine. The issue comes in how much damage you actually put out, because the time to kill in this is longer than most of the other Call of Duty games. And the weapon balancing is a bit of a mess, so what you end up with is the so-called BAL 27 tryhards, where there was one particular build for a very, very long time, where if you use the BAL 27, then it's basically the best gun in the game. Honestly, I never really had too much luck with it. The best weapon I ended up using was actually the AK-12, which is just kind of a run-of-the-mill assault rifle in this. But it is a problem that kept popping up. And the score streaks really aren't all that useful in the grand scheme of things other than the UAV and things like that. So more often than not, I actually just don't even bother putting score streaks in my loadouts and focus entirely on weapon attachments and the perks. And that generally worked out, at least when the level design was cooperating with me. You see, there's one really nasty problem with this thing with regards to how the actual game is designed. You have the exosuit, so you have that added verticality and you have that added speed. The problem is that the maps aren't designed for it. They're pretty typical modern Call of Duty maps in that they're just generally combat arenas with a bunch of stuff in them, and nothing is particularly well designed. You don't really have very many good routes, there's not really any good sniping perches, it's just kind of a jumbled mess where you're supposed to run around and shoot and die until eventually somebody wins. And that ultimately just drags the game down, because there's really no good flow to the maps, and the multiplayer itself just ends up being a jumbled, chaotic mess as a result. And that's regardless of which mode you're playing, whether you're just playing a simple team deathmatch, or kill confirmed, or domination, capture the flag, whatever it may well be, it's just gonna be a mess to play it. Add to that the fact that the multiplayer itself runs on peer-to-peer and matchmaking as opposed to dedicated servers, and you have a recipe for disaster. Obviously, cheating was pretty rampant on this thing when it came out, and that has since died down because basically nobody's playing this anymore. But that only makes the lag issues even worse than they already were. That's not to say the multiplayer doesn't have good things, it certainly does. The supply drop system is actually kind of interesting because it adds an element of chance to the game. Although that's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand you have your supply drops that will just give you various cosmetic items, and that's perfectly fine, I have absolutely no issues with that whatsoever, but they also drop special variants of weapons as well as unique weapons entirely. For example, you can get an STG-44 or an MP-40 or an M1 Garand, and those are all exclusively through the supply drops, so if you want them you have to basically get a bunch of supply drops and just hope that the RNG favors you. And that's the difference. Cosmetic stuff I have absolutely no issue with whatsoever, and in fact I kind of encourage it as far as the supply drop stuff goes. As long as it doesn't affect the gameplay, I'm fine with it. But then once I started throwing the weapons into them, I started to take offense to it. Although admittedly it is nice to have these special variants of the various weapons that you can get that might have a different skin as well as some slightly different stats, but let's face it, it couldn't be any more transparent of an attempt to monetize even more aspects of the game if they just put a price tag on every single supply drop. And of course I mentioned that this does give you cosmetic items for your character. Once again, you can customize your character like you could in Call of Duty Ghosts. In fact, that was one of the very few things that Ghosts did really well. And this one follows in those footsteps. You can play as either a male or female character, and you can pretty much customize them to your heart's content. As I said, you'll get various cosmetic items in your supply drops, so you can get different outfits and different bits of armor, different exosuits, things like that, which do allow you to change up the way your character looks, and that's kinda cool. It's always nice to have more personalization options, but they aren't enough to really bring the game up. The multiplayer itself is basically just normal Call of Duty multiplayer with a movement system it is not designed around, with maps that aren't designed around the movement system. So it means that every single game mode descends into complete chaos and just isn't fun to play. And that's ultimately the biggest problem with the game. The multiplayer just crapped out on itself, whereas the single player actually rose to the occasion, which is kind of the polar opposite of what we think with regards to the Call of Duty series these days. And while I was able to get at least some fun out of the multiplayer, mostly I just got my money's worth out of the game itself overall. I got more out of the campaign than anything else, and that legitimately surprised me. But if you take it as a whole package, what you end up with is just a fairly average game. It's got one of the better campaigns in the Call of Duty series, and it does have some kind of cool ideas in it that definitely spice up the gameplay. It's just that they don't really work out as well as they could. Ultimately, I'm giving this a 2.5 out of 5. It is an underwhelming experience, mostly because the multiplayer is so incredibly weak. And that's ultimately what makes me hesitate to recommend this immediately, that and the massive amount of technical problems that the PC version has. But the single player itself is actually worth a play if you like this sort of campaign. I just don't recommend getting it unless you get it on a pretty hefty discount. Thanks for watching.